Back again. Another episode of A Muslim and an Atheist Breaks Bread. You're saying, Pops?
I'm good, man.
Yeah.
Cold, but I'm good.
Winter is upon us, people. Don't let them
Feels
fool
like
you.
it.
It is, man.
August, innit?
Yeah, it don't matter. You're sticking to the traditional seasons. Them
True,
seasons
yo.
are done.
You think so?
Gone. It's crazy, don't it? Because this has probably been the worst summer on record.
That I can recall, that's for certain.
So from if you can recall that, that's got to be my lifetime then. So, anyway, we're going to do a video today called How Britain Unmade India. Obviously, as we know, India was one of like the richest places. A bit like, you know, I know we relate back to Africa a lot, but one of the richest continents the world has ever seen. The spices, minerals, food, raw materials that India had was crazy, and it got pillaged by the what they called that? The East
pillagers.
the pillagers from the village, the East Indian Tea Company, and they raped it. So we know that much already. So
I think it's just the East Indian Company, innit?
is that what it's called? Where did I get the tea company? Oh, it's a Boston Tea Company, isn't it?
Well,
Yeah. Sorry.
Mechanic.
My apologies. It's early.
East Indian Company. So
East Indian Company, that's it. It also had a big hand in slavery as well, but we won't go into that.
business.
Right, so this video has popped up on my timeline. Basically, I like the thumbnail, so I'm gonna watch it. We're gonna see how Britain unmade India. I wonder if an English person made this or an Indian person made it. Just because I'm just thinking of the terminology used, how Britain unmade India.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like how Britain oppressed, pillaged India. It's unmade, which is quite a weird term to say.
Why?
I just think it's how Britain unmade India. You can't unmake India. You robbed India. You didn't unmake it though, did you? India's still there. It's still one of the, or coming up as a superpower. So you haven't unmade it, have you? You didn't actually destroy Indian culture. You just robbed India of its goods.
No, I think they impacted on the culture significantly and development
100%.
of India and the progress that
But
could have been made
but
in that period.
But did they unmake India? You see, if you said unmake.
Yeah, because India was one of the great civilizations. It already had structure and organization and everything.
Yeah,
Them coming in
100%.
unpacked all the religious groups, set them against each other, use difference and stunted progress. So you unmake a structure. They became the managers. So the Indians weren't managing anything.
Okay.
Unmake society.
I can see that. I can see where you come with that argument. It's like I said, it's a terminology, unmade, but again, it hasn't been unmade. Like I wouldn't say Britain or the world unmade Africa.
If they said
unmade.
erased, then I would say it hasn't been erased.
No.
But
See,
in
I would
terms
say,
of
the Tasmanians that unmade the Tasmanians.
no, they erased the Tasmanians.
Yeah. So, well, either way, anyway, let's jump into the video. Damn, long intro that was. Let's get into the video. I know you lot are probably bored now.
India's share in the world's economy was an astounding 27%, more than all of Europe combined. 250 years later, India's share had dropped to less than 3%, and its people were left impoverished. What happened? Strap in, adventurers. We're about to dive into a dark and messy history. Welcome to 18th century India. In 1707 CE, the death of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb sends the empire into a decades-long spiral. In his wake, an endless parade of weak princelings forced themselves upon the peacock throne.
What was his name? I just missed it.
Hold
on, I'm just gonna go back because
Mongol.
yeah, Mongol. Let me have a look at what my man's name is.
Spiral. In his wake,
No.
an endless parade of
I'm gonna get trigger happy with
sends
this
the empire into
one.
a decades-long spiral. In his wake, an endless parade of weak princelings forced themselves upon the peacock throne. With the Mughal Empire teetering on the brink of collapse, Regional powers jostle for supremacy, land grabs and title claims, infighting and betrayal. India is vulnerable. The situation is so precarious that in 1739, Persian Emperor Nadir Shah invades North India and sacks Delhi. During this period of disorder, the British sensed opportunity. Leveraging their unique advantages as a foreign power, they bribed and blasted their way into a dominant position in the subcontinent. India was no stranger to dealing with foreign aggression, but the British were not like those who had come before.
No.
They were not like Nadir Shah, who looted and simply left. Nor were they like the Huns, who, while shedding Gupta blood, became Indian themselves. Yes, the British were different, for they saw India as an inexhaustible gold mine whose resources were to be forever extracted. By the time India won its independence in 1947, its native institutions had been demolished, its economy deindustrialized, its trade networks severed, and its people more deeply divided by caste and creed. In just 200 years of colonial rule, the India that once inspired the world was unmade.
Does that sound like unmade to you then, bro?
Yeah, it does sound like unmade, but again, this is why I said I wonder who's telling this story. Because I can make anything sound like I wanted to make it. But yeah, I get what you're saying. It was unmade. Britain went and put their stamp and ideology into India.
Well, they took all the core
It's just
elements
the word
out.
unmade. I'm
Just
like,
left the people.
You can't you can't really unmake a country. It's just a weird, like, I just think it's a weird way to put it. But
So if you had a country that had, for example, a sewage system,
yeah,
and then you come and the sewage system packs up, doesn't work anymore,
that's how unmade the sewage system.
right? So that's what Britain did.
Yeah, but when's that unmade the country?
But that's what they did to every single service in the country.
Yeah. I get that. Like I said, I do get what you're saying. It's just a weird term to me. So you're unmade India. Well, again,
Well,
Indians, they
Wasn't
Britain.
called India. See what I'm saying? Every aspect.
Alright, so that was the Persians, wasn't it? Called it India, not the British. So people from the Indus Valley, India, whatever you want to say, yeah. Do you think Britain unmade India? I'm not saying they didn't have an effect, but did they unmake India? That's all I want to know. So if you get this far in the video, please put in the comments. I just find it weird. To me, it's the kind of a thing like saying that India had no like resilience, where a lot of their culture is still around. It hasn't been completely wiped out, destroyed. Yeah, their economy got decimated, but again, it's on the bounce back. So they didn't really unmake it. They thwarted it, slowed down progression, but they didn't unmake it.
That's why it's unmaking.
However, as well, no, it actually says how the British unmade. But
Making. The
What-
unmaking.
yeah, it's two different titles, isn't it? But what I would also say is he missed out the part about the tea company. I know we've only just started the video, but there is
Well, that's
Indian tea
presented as
company, innit?
the British. The term
yeah,
the
yeah.
British represents.
But what I'm saying is that's quite an important part of it to actually disseminate between the British government and a company. One's a company that had no bearing with the British government. The British government didn't even like deal with the East Indian Tea Company up until a certain point. It was only when they took control of India they were like,
And they took control.
that's when the British come in and said. But realistically, like I
But
said,
it was a group of English businessmen who set the company up and did the plunder in exactly the
100%.
same way. In the
Yeah.
Caribbean, they used to have British ships and they were the pirates as well. So, Britain has a strategy everywhere it goes of doing things, but the purpose.
yeah, look. Go on.
The purpose remains the same. They have a unique approach to getting what they want, where they want, and leaving the country on its knees is what unmaking is, from someone standing and they're being left on their knees, and that's what they do when they colonize.
Yeah. Listen, I get this. I get Britain,
Unmake.
colonizers. It's more. I guess it just comes into a thing of like, it almost makes it sound like. I guess from my point, the reason why I don't
Like erased.
the reason why I don't like the terminology is because it makes it seem like they've just left in their wake a load of victims. I guess I'm not even saying that really, but just in my head, it's like if someone said to me, "Well, they unmade black culture," I'd be like, "Well, that haven't. I mean, for what you've done to black culture, you haven't unmade it. Yeah, you may have freud it, you may have like tampered with it, messed it up, but you ain't unmade it, because that just to me leaves, I don't know, it doesn't sit right. That's what I'm saying."
Well, culture's fluid anyway, so it wouldn't apply there. It's got to be something, like I say, where there's tangible things that change and are impacted, which is what they present here. All these institutions which made the economy rich, import, export, ruling the sea, trade, all linked in the same thing. So once they control the aspect, you don't have that anymore. Britain rules the waves, all your trade links, partnerships, everything severed. For 100 years, let's say. That's a long time in terms of having business acronym expertise and practice. A whole 3 generations, that is in it. A generation. You can lose skills, so it does set you back. And in every single area, yes, there were always academics and things like that, but that's like one person, and the brain drain, they would take those people out and have them in the West doing great things. So they plunder your brain, everything. They unmake you. You don't have the strength to have people in power with knowledge and power collectively to organize and do the thing until, like them say, if they had them, as soon as they became independent, they would have become strong. They've had to build capacity over these last years and get organized. And again, now they're at the brink where they're doing it again.
So if it took Britain 100 years to unmake India, or just over 100 years?
More than 100, but I said in 100.
300, yeah. So
in 100.
Yeah. I was going to say
so it's more than 100.
Yeah, there's a couple hundred, ain't it? Like they said, like they went there, in the 17th, 18th century?
Well, the British, like you said, they came in phases, but I would say the first few years was the attrition when the government didn't own it, but once them had it, them come in. So let's say if it was one of the last 100 years the Crown was responsible for, really, it's still a long time. Yeah. All right, let's jump in.
The halcyon days of India are over. She has been drained of all the wealth she once possessed, and her energies have been cramped by a sordid system of misrule. The deliberate bleeding of India by the British was so extreme that famed American scholar Will Durant referred to it as the greatest crime in all of history. So let's pull back the curtain and see what India was like before colonialism. In the 19th century, the American J.T. Sunderland wrote about the India that the British found when they arrived. India was a far greater industrial and manufacturing nation than any in Europe or Asia. Her textile goods were famous all over the civilized world. So was her exquisite jewelry and her precious stones. So was her pottery, her porcelains and ceramics. So were her fine works in metal, iron, steel, silver, and gold. She had great architecture, equal in beauty to any in the world. She had great merchants, businessmen, bankers, and financiers. She was not only a great shipbuilding nation, but had commerce and trade which extended to all civilized countries. That may seem like heavy-handed praise, but the record does show that pre-colonial India was a dominant manufacturing economy. Let's take a closer look at the textile, shipbuilding, and metalworking industries. India was a textile superpower for most of its long history. There were many textile centers in the subcontinent. Coastal Andhra was a block printing hub, for example, while Gujarat and Bengal were known for their high-end woven products. There was global demand for these items. In fact, India enjoyed a mind-blowing 25% share of the global textile trade by the mid-18th century. This thriving textile trade had knock-on effects for the entire economy. For example, the popularity of Indian textiles led to the creation of stable international distribution networks. By piggybacking on these networks, other Indian artisans could sell their goods worldwide at a reduced cost. As a result, many different industries flourished alongside the Indian textile industry. We know that international trade was conducted primarily along maritime routes, and so the Indian shipbuilding industry had developed into a behemoth too. A significant number of Indian ports were engaged in the shipbuilding industry. Dhaka, Mausalapatnam, Surat, Calicut, Quilon, and many, many others. Entire rural communities were involved in the production and processing of materials used to construct ships. Quality was paramount. Consider the Bengali merchant fleet in the early 17th century. The fleet consisted of nearly 5,000 ships, each capable of carrying up to 500 tons of goods. These ships were constructed in Bengali ports by native artisans who had the skills to craft elaborate wood, iron, and brass fittings. According to one British maritime observer, Indian vessels combine elegance and utility and are models of fine workmanship. Merchant contracts indicate that Bengali ships were much more durable than English ships. Bengali ships had an average lifespan exceeding 20 years, while English ships were not known to last more than 12. Quite a difference. India was a longtime pioneer in the global steel industry. As early as the 6th century CE, crucible-formed steel, which came to be known as Wootz or Damascus steel in the West, was being produced for export by Indian blacksmiths, particularly along the Malabar coast and in the Deccan. Arab and European officers regularly imported blades from India. While these blades were purchased as wartime implements, they were so robust and beautifully crafted that they also served as a mark of high status in times of peace. Though we've barely scratched the surface, it should already be clear that India was a manufacturing juggernaut, a thriving exporter of high-quality goods to markets throughout the world. How did the British manage to unmake all of that? The fundamental principle of the British has been to make the whole Indian nation subservient to the interests and benefits of themselves. And so, once the British took power, they changed the entire dynamic of the Indian economy to suit their own interests. The first step? Dismantling all native industry. To start, they established a legal monopoly over Indian textile goods and cut off the export market, which immediately disrupted long-standing trade links. Having now made themselves the exclusive buyers of Indian textiles, the British then changed the way that they paid for those goods. Instead of using foreign currency, they paid using the tax revenues extracted from India. The Indian economy stagnated and prices collapsed. Skilled artisans, who once fueled the vibrant Indian economic engine, were now significantly poorer and more restricted than ever before. And it didn't stop there. Soon enough, British manufacturers lobbied their government to completely eliminate the competition from the Indian textile industry. See, despite the restrictions imposed on Indian industry, British manufacturers were still finding it difficult to compete with Indian products. Company soldiers were sent to smash Indian looms. According to several different accounts, they even went around breaking the thumbs of weavers so that they could no longer ply their trade. But that's not all. To ensure that the Indian textile industry could not recover, adapt, or innovate itself back into relevancy, the British imposed an absurdly harsh 80% tariff. This had an immediate catch-22 trap effect. Exporting goods from India to the UK was now economically unviable. But remember, Indians were restricted from selling to anyone else. Similar restrictions were imposed on nearly every branch of manufacturing in India. India was reduced.
It's horrible, isn't it? They're just horrible people when you get into them positions. Imagine like going around and just breaking people's fingers because you didn't want them to work. Savage.
India was reduced to being a mere exporter of raw materials, like cotton and metal ore, so that the British could sell finished products back to Indians at a premium. We conquered India as an outlet for the goods of Britain. I'm not such a hypocrite to say that we hold India for the Indians. The colonial deindustrialization process was so complete that by 1947, only 0.7% of India was employed in any form of manufacturing. But skilled workers had to go somewhere, do something. The British monopoly on industrial production drove Indian artisans, merchants, builders, and others into agriculture en masse. In the words of Dr. Charles Hall, India's population has been thrown back upon the soil because Britain's discriminating duties have ruined every branch of native manufacture. Rural wages cratered to historical lows, and in fact, the land itself could not sustain the influx of newly disenfranchised workers. Poor seasonal harvests and droughts gave way to catastrophic famines and mass poverty. With most Indians now converted into peasant cultivators, the British sought to exploit them further. They began to tax cultivators as the primary revenue source for the administration. Taxes were extreme, pegged at 50 to 80% of gross income and calculated before the harvest. The result? Indian cultivators often owed more in taxes than they earned as income. The British knew how harsh this really was. They openly conceded that they were imposing the highest tax rates in the world, and that taxes were more than 3 times higher than they had ever been under Indian rulers. To add insult to injury, the British even bragged about it in Parliament. The Indians have been taxed to the utmost limit. Every province has been made a field for higher exaction, and it has always been our boast how greatly we have raised the revenue above that which the native rulers were able to extort. Colonial taxes were so burdensome that 2/3 of the population in directly ruled British areas fled to the hinterlands, where native Indian lords could at least minimally protect them from financial depredation. The millions who stayed behind could hardly afford to pay taxes, and the situation was worsened by the fact that the British did not negotiate tax payments. Horrors were perpetrated under the guise of sinless mathematical neutrality. Tax defaulters were confined in cages and exposed to the burning sun. Fathers sold their children to meet the rising rates. Vulnerable peasants were physically tortured to pay up, and when they didn't have the means to pay, the British confiscated their farmland for themselves. Tens of millions of landless peasants were created for the first time in Indian history. By the end of the 19th century, India was Britain's largest source of revenue by far, its largest purchaser of exports, and a source of highly paid employment for both British civil servants and soldiers, and they were all paid for by Indian taxes. Many British officials freely acknowledged the exploitative nature of the colonial enterprise. In fact, a Prime Minister of the UK, the Marquess of Salisbury, himself admitted, "As India is to be bled of money, the lancet should be directed to those parts where the blood is congested." And just like that, India and its people were bled dry. The fundamental issue of British overlordship was the fact that the British had no intention to become one with the land or to rule it as their own. The British saw India as innately and eternally foreign, and this justified their creation and maintenance of what scholars have referred to as an extractive colony. For comparison's sake, consider the Turkic peoples who invaded India and eventually formed the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. Look, the Mughals were no heroes. They imposed unequal taxes, engaged in religious discrimination, plundered local treasuries, visited great violence upon their enemies, and exhibited a Persianized racial arrogance. But one thing is clear: India's wealth was preserved at a foundational level. After nearly 2 centuries of Mughal rule, India was still a dominant economic power, responsible for 27% of global trade. There's a simple reason for that. See, the Mughals had a foreign place of origin, Fergana, but they did not repatriate India's resources to their original homeland. India may not have been Fergana, but it had become their new home, and so their loyalties and energies were owed solely to India. Meanwhile, the British ruled India as disconnected tyrants. The bulk of the revenue from India wasn't reinvested in India. No. It was extracted and repatriated to their distant, foggy homeland. How much? Modern economists have estimated that the total amount of wealth that the British extracted from India is in the ballpark of $43 trillion. Yes, $43 trillion. When taxes are not spent in the country from which they are raised, they constitute an absolute loss and extinction of the whole amount withdrawn from the taxed country. The money might as well be thrown into the sea. Such is the nature of the tribute we have so long exacted from India. Apologists for colonial rule often point to the railways as some sort of extravagant counter to the argument of extraction and divestment. But as modern scholars have pointed out, the railways serve as evidence for how exploitative and inefficient British investment in India really was. First, there's the bold assumption that Indians would not have built railways, like the Japanese or others, either by importing the technology or by developing their own. India had been far too advanced and cutting edge of civilization to not keep up had it been given the opportunity to do so. When the British came to India, the country was the leader of Asiatic civilization. Japan was nowhere. Now, in 50 years, Japan has revolutionized her history with the aid of modern arts of progress, and India, burdened by 150 years of English rule, is condemned to tutelage. But let's ignore that for now. Initially, the Indian railways were positioned as a grand investment scheme for British shareholders. The government guaranteed substantial returns of at least 5% per year. And when the revenues were not enough to pay out these returns, Indian taxpayers covered all the losses. Because of these taxpayer-backed guarantees, construction of the railways was extremely inefficient.
English people love taxes, don't they? Love taxes. Do you know what's crazy? I was just thinking about that then. How it just said about, you know, people go, oh, but they gave them the railway. Or even how we were talking before on how Indians and people from the Caribbean love, like, the British Empire. But it's weird when you see things like this to think that, innit? It's kind of like, oh, wow, how could you even, like, love the British Empire when you see things like this, like what they actually done to you, done to your country, done to your people. But then you have to put it into context, innit? Obviously YouTube and things like that weren't around, so knowledge is accessible now, isn't it?
More accessible.
More accessible.
But also more erratic in the way it presents itself. Like I said before, you would have someone who did a lot of research and wrote a book and it took a long time.
Yeah, or they might get one, like, piece in the paper or something.
Well, they tend to be like, it had to be somebody academic or somebody of repute to be sent to be studying pyramids in the first place.
Yeah,
you understand?
yeah.
Someone had to finance you or something. So, but now, like I said, everybody's a armchair journalist and can flip a few videos and do a bit of animation. So it comes in different forms, but you know, it doesn't matter on the basis that as the generations go on, that's why I say for me, my experience was more African history awakening. For you, like me say, you come into this from a different angle. Whereas mine African centered, because everything that they tell me about it was African centered in the first place. So at that time it was the music and people were communicating
Yeah, I think
history
like,
through the music.
Definitely. I think our angles are different in just in the sense of like, one, I don't see myself as like an African. I've African descent, yes, but I'm not African. I'm British. Like that's quite clear. But just world history intrigues.
Culturally, you're British.
World history intrigues me more. And like I said, like on this whole channel, like we'll stick with India for a bit. India's a big place, so we're gonna. But when we get into Africa, I imagine we're gonna be in Africa for a very long time. Because to break down African history is gonna be a minefield.
No, I think everything that's happened here in India
Has happened
informs
in Africa.
us about how the British applied their trade, which is what it's about. Add the actual detail, or you know.
Yeah, the way the British did, but remember, there's also the British, the Dutch, the Belgians. You know what I mean? There's a lot, and obviously Africa, India's India, Africa's like countries. Africa's the continent. So when you go into African history, and I could be wrong again. Like obviously there was tribes in India and different parts and like different rules. But I said we've not really touched on all that part of Indian history yet. But I can imagine when we go into the African side of that as well, that's going to be very like deep dive. So
It's gonna be the same. Like I said, they've just used the same method and stamped it everywhere they went. There was no, you know, I think Tasmania was extreme, but it's not the only place
I
they've
think
done
the
that.
difference in Africa is that I feel like India's kind of been allowed to breathe, whereas Africa's still kind of been
Oppressed, plundered.
Yeah. So I feel like that's going to be one of the major differences. Like there's a lot of and there's a lot of stuff that goes. There's a lot of things that go on in India as well. When we're talking about pharmaceutical companies
Of
using
course.
their kids and things which we haven't looked into yet as well, and that stuff goes on heavily in Africa as well. But let's finish the video anyway. But yeah, just crazy to me how there's this love of the British. But like I said, we're a generation where knowledge is accessible, so we have to keep that relevant.
Well, the British is an idea. Like I say, it's not love of the British, it's love of the idea of the British, because what's the British? You know, there's people from all over the world living here.
There's people, I go to a lot of Caribbean households. And Indian, actually, I remember like when you just go to Indian and they'd have like the plates of like the Queen and the royal family, all the royal family stuff up on the wall, and I'd be like, right, like, you lot really love this stuff, innit? Whereas me being British,
they loved it when they were in their country.
But it's like you said before, when they was in their country, they thought they was British.
No, they were British.
Well, this is what I'm saying, innit? But that's still weird when you know that the British people have come over and colonised and just, like you said, unmade your whole history.
Initially.
It's Stockholm Syndrome, essentially.
Effectively.
But, yeah, and that's what it is, isn't it?
But Stockholm Syndrome is something that happens, whereas this is something that was imposed, the system imposed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Come on, go.
Here's a fun stat. Every mile of Indian rail cost £18,000 to construct, as compared to £2,000 for the same mile built in the United States. All the elements of railway construction, steel, wagons, gears, engines, and more, were produced by British manufacturers. Indians weren't even given an opportunity to produce their own manufactured alternatives because the British government imposed restrictions that prevented Indians from competing. Worse still, the essential purpose of the railways was to assist the British enterprise in the exploitation of the natural resources of India. In fact, the railways made it possible for the British to export enormous amounts of grain and other agricultural products, which sparked and exacerbated famines. Over the course of British rule in India, an estimated 35 million preventable deaths were caused by famines. That's millions more than those killed under Stalin or Mao, and that's 5 times more than the Holocaust. The British were directly responsible for this. They mass exported Indian foodstuffs to Britain and other countries in Europe, even during drought periods. Food in India became too expensive for peasants to afford. According to Dr. Charles Hall, India starves so that its annual tax revenue to England may not be diminished by $1. There is plenty of grain in India. The trouble is that the people have been ground down till they are too poor to buy it. The British had no interest in provisioning for Indian lives. Famine non-intervention was official government policy. How ironic, given that heavy-handed British intervention and market manipulation is what sparked the famines in the first place. And when good people, Indians and foreigners, worked together to help famine-affected peasants, the British government made efforts to stop them. They were furious that the government's own failures were being highlighted. Don't believe me? Listen to this British officer in his own words. Scores of corpses were tumbled into old wells because the deaths were too numerous for the relatives to perform funeral rites. Mothers sold their children for a single meal. Husbands flung their wives into ponds to escape the torment of seeing them perish from hunger. But amid these scenes of death, the British government in India was unmoved. Newspapers were persuaded into silence. Strict orders were given to civilians. Do not acknowledge that civilians are dying of hunger. And if you think that Indians would have done a worse job, consider this. There hasn't been a single large-scale Indian famine in the 70-plus years since British rule ended. Not one. Independent India has its flaws, but it has been overwhelmingly better at providing for the care, safety, and prosperity of its own people. And now you know.
And now you know. Yeah, now we do know. That's crazy about the famine numbers. 35 million people.
India's share in the
35 million people died in the famine. And it's government policy as well. That's what's crazy, you know. And
it's government policy.
But the British government
policy.
I'm
just making sure you put that part in there.
Yeah. The British government policy.
Well,
Extract all the food. I mean, listen, we can act like we don't know that. Sometimes it's a bit of a witch hunt, isn't it? We know that Britain was evil. Like, in terms of it's foreign policy.
I don't know.
It's foreign
If we
policy
know,
was.
I don't know if we know.
Yeah.
I know there's a little sense of it for some people, but this is what I say. All that stuff there, that's just one of the many.
Well, this is what I'm saying, and we know these things happen, but does it ever? Do you think? And this is the other thing. Like when we have these conversations, I have these conversations with my friends, and like their first thing is, yeah, but like I wasn't there. I didn't do that. So, and I was trying to explain to someone the other day that like, just because, first of all, when we're talking about topics like this, whether it's race, politics, or how Britain went on, it's not a personal attack to the person who I'm speaking to. It's not like just because you're white, I'm trying to attack you. I'm just telling you the facts, ain't it? But because people get
white doesn't make British first and foremost. So
yeah, but
like
what we're
I
talking
said,
about exactly. I've just said that as
the
well. I said I am.
descendants of the people who did it at that time.
Yes, okay.
We'll
Which
always
90
say they
okay.
have benefited, but who knows? That's the argument aside. But in terms of the crimes committed, the crown is responsible, and
Exactly.
those people who ascribe
It's
to be subjects of
institutional,
the
and
crown
this is what I'm
inherently
saying,
become
yes.
responsible. So the British term refers to everybody who says, I'm British, and I'm this and I'm that.
Yes. So, again, but the point I was making is because of that self-guilt that they have, no one's trying to impose it on them. It's the way they feel about it. They'd rather, like, break down what you've said to dismiss the wrongdoing at all, to try to negate their own guilt, which I think is what terminates as a white fragility.
It's called spin.
Spin. That's it.
They invented spin to deal with all the nuances of things that happen. The one thing
Pretend you can't see the bodies burning.
They've always known from the beginning of, all the way back to Charlemagne. They're running their program of constant growth in power, wealth, and all this. It's the same program that's being run. Now, those people and their descendants are still running things. So, in exactly the same way we see things happening in the world now, like Ukraine and Russia, there's always somebody somewhere on something making money, and the rest of us are left to wonder why. But, these people are ruthless, and the impact is never fully reported, because then they wouldn't be able to do it again. It's always reported on the basis of our common good.
Do you think these things...
Our common good. We've got to do this because it's for our common good.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a really stupid question, but the answer's like in the face. Like, if we look at Iraq and Iran and them places, probably were the last.
Sold on a common good.
Yeah, this is what I was just about to say. I was going to say, do you think these things, because this is the other, people don't think these things happen today. They're like, nah, that wouldn't happen. That wouldn't happen today. Like, and I'm like, but it does happen today. That's what boggles my mind when people see it go, oh yeah, but that was ages ago. That doesn't happen today.
Yeah.
I'm like, what you going on about?
The media creates the disconnect. So we live, at a time, like I said, where apartheid still exists, but technically the media have eradicated that term by ending apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid doesn't exist, but there's lots of countries that's in apartheid
like
right
Palestine
now.
as well.
Right, without me pointing it out.
Yeah.
You understand? So this is what I'm saying. The media controls people's thoughts, the way they think and everything. So they hype something up, and then when they're finished with it, when they're finished with it, they just discount and everybody moves on. No one says, oh, but did you hear the truth about what really happened? Nobody does that bit. The Lady Diana incident, for example. Come on, man. These people will never ever come out and talk about it fully, like, the allegations, my man's son ain't his son, and how it finished in the tunnel.
Oh, yeah.
You understand? These things will never ever get followed up, and society No one's demanding it. If people demanded
Well, people don't really want to look at the truth. And
this is
that's
what I'm
why the
saying.
truth
They're happy
becomes very
being British, so
complicated and
everyone
simple and-
by
yeah.
is responsible because of that. The descendants of the kids, you and me, you understand, responsible for the past because we, like I say, enjoy the benefits and we're part of the assimilated hype, you know.
Yeah, man. All right, so that was how the British unmade India. We out. Peace.